This video is brought to you by Henson Shaving. On Wednesday, Donald Tusk was finally sworn in as Poland's new Prime Minister. While much of the media attention is focused on his plans to strengthen ties with the EU, which became strained under the previous Law and Justice administration, he's also promised massive new benefits for families with children in an attempt to stimulate Poland's appallingly low fertility rate. According to the most recent data, Poland currently has perhaps the lowest fertility rates in all of Europe. In September, just over 22,000 babies were born, the lowest number in Poland's modern history, and down nearly 20% on September last year, when nearly 27,000 babies were born. This would imply that Poland currently has a fertility rate of about 1.1, which would be the lowest in the EU when compared against the most recent Eurostat data. To appreciate the severity of the crisis, just look at this graph comparing the annual number of births and deaths over the past 2 decades. While the number of births is relatively stable for most of the 2010s and even spikes in 2019, since the pandemic, it's basically just dropped off a cliff. So in this video, we're going to look at Poland's demographic crisis, its impact on the Polish economy, and Tusk's plans to fix it. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, to understand this video, you're going to need a bit of context. To maintain a stable population, a country needs a fertility rate, that is, the number of births per female, of 2.1. Low fertility rates, that is, a fertility rate significantly below the replacement rate of 2.1, are economically and politically stressful. Low fertility rates mean a smaller and, importantly, an older population. This means there will be less people of working age relative to pensioners, which means a smaller economically productive population sustaining a relatively larger non-productive population. This means 2 things. 1, a smaller economy overall, because you've got fewer working age people, and 2, a higher tax burden on those young people that are working. This is because, assuming you want to maintain your current quality of public services, you need to make sure that you're getting the same amount of tax per capita. But if you've got fewer working age people and more idle pensioners, then you need to tax those working age people more heavily to keep standards up. This is both bad economically, a higher tax burden will, at least in theory, discourage working, and bad socially, because it creates intergenerational unfairness. Like most post-communist countries, Poland saw its birth rate collapse in the 90s, going from about 2.3 in the 80s to about 1.3. Poland's demographic crisis became particularly acute in the 2000s for 2 reasons. First, for most of the 2000s, Poland's fertility rate was the lowest in the post-communist space, hovering at about 1.3. What makes this so notable is that, unlike other post-communist countries, Poland was a deeply religious country. A 2008 Gallup poll found that 75% of Poles considered religion important to them, way higher than other post-communist countries like the Baltics or Russia, and the highest of any large European country. This is unusual because religiosity usually positively correlates with fertility, i.e. countries with higher rates of weekly worship, for instance, also generally have higher fertility rates, so you'd expect Poland to have at least higher fertility rates than its post-communist peers. Second, emigration. Poland's population was relatively stable in the first decade or so after the fall of communism in 1989, but the number of people emigrating increased significantly in the late 1990s to about 100,000 per year, and then skyrocketed after Poland joined the EU in 2004. Empowered by freedom of movement, millions of Poles left their home country to work in the rest of Europe, in search of higher wages and better living standards. Over the next few years, over 2 million Poles moved abroad, mostly to Western Europe and the UK, where the Polish population increased more than tenfold. By 2011, it was estimated that 5% of all Polish citizens had lived outside the country, and a 2014 survey found that an astonishing 90% of Poles under 34 had considered emigrating. Interestingly, then, Prime Minister Donald Tusk, whose Civic Platform party ruled Poland from 2007 until 2015, realised that this was a problem and implemented a whole load of policies to offset it, making Tusk's government one of the first in the world to talk explicitly about demographic crises. Broadly, Tusk did two things. First, he introduced tax breaks for families, including one that only kicked in once you had your second child. And second, he loosened Poland's immigration laws, with two amnesties for illegal immigrants in 2007 and 2012. To some extent, Tusk was successful. Having declined every year from 2001 until 2007, Poland's population returned to growth in 2008, although this was largely because Poland's economic boom reduced emigration. Anyway, when they came to power in 2015, Law and Justice basically continued Tusk's policies. Despite campaigning on an anti-immigration platform, they continued to loosen immigration laws, and Poland has reliably issued the most residence permits in the entire EU. They also introduced a monthly benefit of 500 zlotys, or roughly €120, per child starting with the second born, which is immensely popular in Poland. In 2019, the scheme was expanded to include all children under 18, regardless of family income, and it's due to increase to 800 zlotys, or nearly €200, in January. Unsurprisingly, this would cost a lot of money. Around 7 million children are covered, and it's contributed to Poland's ballooning deficit, which is due to top 5% of GDP next year. If Tusk goes ahead with the raise to 800 zloty, which he said he will, then the child benefit scheme alone would account for over 2.5% of GDP. Unfortunately for Poland, these policies haven't really worked. Poland's population returned to decline in 2012, and as we mentioned in the intro, its fertility rate is now at an all-time low of 1.1. Again, it's worth taking a look at that graph showing the number of births per quarter. Since 2017, the number of births has plummeted, and if this trend continues, Poland will end up with one of the lowest fertility rates not just in Europe, but in the world. This is yet another worrying data point for the growing number of countries that are experiencing fertility crises. The fact that billions of euros in direct child benefits hasn't stemmed Poland's fertility collapse suggests that if countries want to reboot their fertility rate, direct pro-natalist policies probably aren't enough.
I've been using Henson's products for a few months now, and I really do recommend them from an economic, environmental, and shave perspective. Firstly, Henson's razors take entirely standard razor blades, which means instead of being forced to buy expensive replacement blades, including features you don't even need, Henson's razors cost about 10 cents each, allowing you to replace your blades more frequently and cut down costs significantly. Now, admittedly, the razor itself may cost more than other brands, but over the lifetime of the products, it quickly becomes a lot cheaper than buying all of those expensive replacement blades. This razor model is also better for the environment, with the Henson AL13 and all of its packaging being entirely plastic-free. Plus, unlike those expensive multi-blade upsells that other companies will push, even the blades themselves are plastic-free, helping to cut down on the over 2 billion disposable razors that are thrown away every year in the US alone. Finally, Henson's beautiful razors are precision engineered by an aerospace machine company who previously built parts for the Mars rover and the ISS, which means incredibly tight tolerances, high standards, and superb precision. And all of this combined means that while a single razor blade might sound scary, I've found it far easier to use than other comparable products, with a precise shave plane of about 0.0013 inches, offering a safe and perfect shave, while also minimizing the risk of ingrown hairs and irritation. So if you too want to try out Henson, then you can get 100 free blades with your purchase by clicking the link in the description, adding the razor and the blades to your basket, and then using our code. Thanks to Henson for sponsoring this video, and to you for supporting TLDR News.